Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Morgan Harris. I'm with Acacia Consulting Group, and we work with Good Government Illinois to produce events like this one. Tonight's virtual town hall is with State Senator Robert Peters and State Rep Kelly Cassidy, and of course, it is moderated by David Orr. So welcome to everyone in our Zoom room, and we're still getting some folks connected in. And welcome to everybody who's watching on Facebook Live tonight. In order to minimize background noise, only tonight's panelists and moderator will be unmuted. If you'd like to turn off your video cameras, you can do so in the toolbar below on your Zoom screen on the bottom right side, because again, we are streaming on Facebook Live. We have a number of questions from our audience already. Thank you so much for sending those in. And we're going to try to get to as many of them as possible tonight in the time we have. If you have a question during the event, please type it into the chat box and we'll do our best to get those answered as well. This event will stay up on our Facebook page, and you'll also be able to find it on our webpage at www.goodgovernmentillinois.com. Good Government Illinois is a nonprofit organization, and we depend on the generous support of our community, and that's you. So if you are able, please consider chipping in so we can continue to bring you events like this. And you can again donate online at www.goodgovernmentillinois.com. And now I will turn it over to David Orr. David?
Thank you very much, Morgan. Welcome, everybody. We were chatting, a few of us, before the show. It's kind of those movies, you like to see the outtakes. We have two characters among our guests tonight, so maybe we'll be able to get into that too. Interesting conversations about other than political things. So we have two guests because we're focusing on the legislature. A lot of us don't follow too carefully. We're not necessarily there. We don't maybe understand all the issues that came down. So that's the purpose here. Let me introduce the two guests. We'll get right to it. We have a State Rep, Kelly Cassidy, and we have larger bios that you can see online, but here, just to tell you this much. You know, she was a legislative director for NOW, National Organization for Women, which gave her, quite a bit of insights in a lot of issues, including how the legislature works. She also was in the state's attorney's office. And just to highlight a couple of areas where she's been in the forefront, certainly includes human rights and family and medical leave. She's known to being a smart, tough, speak her mind, doesn't shy away from battles, even had a few with the former Speaker of the House, a guy named Mike Madigan. She lives in Rogers Park, around the corner from me, with her spouse and three sons. So welcome, Kelly. And we're glad to have Senator Robert Peters here tonight. Robert's a really talented young guy, and perhaps some of the hurdles he faced as a kid, which were pretty significant, including some health issues, inspired him to this career of public service. He became a political organizer, where one of the things he did was fought successfully to require Cook County judges to basically set affordable bail limits. Those who have followed that issue know a lot of people are particularly in Cook County Jail because they can't afford the bail. Okay, he also now serves as chairman of the Public Safety Committee, and some of the stuff we'll talk about tonight, he's been a pretty significant player in criminal justice reforms. So welcome, Robert. Okay, so let's just start with a general, maybe a little more political question. Has it made much difference to you personally, or to think your colleagues, that Speaker Madigan is no longer in charge, at least of the House?
Nice handoff there, Robert. Both chambers were under new leadership. We should have hung an under new management sign out in front of the Capitol. And that there were great things and there were challenges related to it. But ultimately change is good. And, David, as you mentioned, I was an early critic of Speaker Madigan and a big part of the group. We call ourselves the 19. Who ultimately held out until we got a new speaker. And, what all of us were united in, none of us came to it from the same perspective, but what we were all united in was normalizing change. Legislatures all over the country get new leadership on the regular. And what we were the outliers, having chamber leadership in place for the better part of my lifetime. So it was different. A lot of Madigan's senior staff stayed around, and I think that was a good thing. I think we needed that stability for the transition year. So I really think we're going to continue to see change. We're really going to get to see what kind of leader Speaker Welch is as he begins to get to build his own team. And I'm excited to see what that looks like. We joked the other day that the biggest change was the sentence, "I texted the speaker," and he texted back. You know, we went from a guy who didn't have a cell phone to a guy who's pretty social media savvy and very tech savvy. And very open and communicative as compared to a guy that, you know, his chief of staff used to have a sign on his desk that says, "No one gets to see the wizard, no one." So that was probably the biggest change. And ultimately it was a positive one. I think there were a lot of folks who were energized, capacity to have an impact. And I'm thrilled with the outcome.
Good. Robert?
I mean, I guess I could talk about the new Senate president. This was his first full session, his sort of first non-COVID specific session. And I think the main thing about President Harmon is the fact that he's not too heavy-handed, right? The idea is that he allows us all to come in, he listens to us, you know, even if we have different ideas, he allows us to have those debates and sort of figure out where we're at as a caucus. There were multiple times this year where, you know, whether there was a block of us who represented that more progressive block, folks who were a little bit more conservative, we're all invited in the space to make a case about where we're at, where we stand. And he listened to us, he took our feedback, and we were able to sort of bring together a more coalition-based model in terms of how we got things done in the Senate. And so for me, it's weird. It's one of those things where I thrive sort of in that organizational space. I do come from organizing, and I always find that to be a challenge because that means you have to have more and more conversations with people about what's going on. But I did appreciate the fact that there was this level of respect. And I think the other thing is that he made it very clear, particularly to us who are younger, more folks of color, progressive, how much he valued our opinion on matters. And I think that's one part, I think, you know, generationally where he's at. And I think that's also politically where he's at. And I think it's also astute to understand that he believes that we're able and capable to sort of self-organize as members about what we need to see in terms of the Senate.
Good. Robert, I love that point where, like, actually, and this was very much a much bigger issue in the House, but like being treated like the grown-ups we are. And you know, being granted that space, there was a lot of control released with both new leaders, I think, but in particular on in my chamber.
Okay, one of our listeners' questions is from Sue Paston, and the question is this: what steps can be taken to ensure that minority ownership happens, particularly in the cannabis industry? Kelly, you had a lot to do with this, so what's the latest on that?
Yeah, so, you know, the original bill, the original law was the first time anybody had tried to find a way past some of the constitutional challenges other states have faced. And so it was, we were trying, right? We were trying something new. And the combination of some of the unintended consequences of what we tried to build and the pandemic hitting at the same time certainly created a situation that was untenable. So we did pass a law or pass a bill, and I believe the governor signed it. But we passed a bill to create some fixes. There will be multiple new lotteries from this same pool, so that a lot of the backlash and justifiable, you know, that first round of dispensary licenses resulted in only 21 entities getting access to the lottery for the 75 licenses. That's tied up in litigation. The bill that Representative Ford passed, that was the result of a better part of a year of negotiation that I participated in. I believe, Robert, you were in some of the meetings along the way as well, but that you know, trying to find a path through. that would get some new licenses onto the street and get them into the hands we intended them to get into. And so there will be 2 more lotteries from that group as a result of this new law, as well as a lot of changes that are going to just make access better, separate from licensing opportunities. But how do we make sure that patients have full access? How do we make sure that the businesses can actually operate within this space? So it's a pretty broad spectrum change, but the biggest piece is these 2 new lotteries that the governor's office has said they hope to have by August, so that we will actually see new licenses on the street this year.
Something came up on the radio today, Kelly. This is certainly good. There will be greater minority participation, but there's no way to catch up, right? In other words, like you can't have them too close to each other. So a site, we're talking about one at like Wrigley Field area. So the challenge will be, we'll get hopefully new minority owners, but there's no way to catch them up to the kind of advantages the early folks got, is there?
I mean, the reality is the market will mature and things will balance out, right? You know, as we look at states that have 10 years under their belt, that didn't make these efforts, absolutely. But we are coming in at a time when our market is incredibly immature and relatively unlimited. And yes, there's a lot of head start that the other folks have. That is the result of the way the medical program was written that made it really hard for folks to get in. And so we have a lot of fixing to do. But ultimately, you know, what we came away with in our research is it takes about 5 years for a market to be fully mature. I frankly believe that the last year and a half is a blip that might not count towards that 5 years, to be honest with you. The not having facilities too close together, the 1,500 feet rule that you mentioned, really was the request of the Black Caucus at the beginning, because they were aware of communities in Denver in particular. That was what was cited most often, that look a lot like, you know, the neighborhoods here where you have a gold store, a liquor store, a sneaker store, a gold store, a liquor store, a sneaker store. They wanted to make sure we didn't have that kind of concentration, and maybe 1,500 feet was overkill. But there is a need to avoid that undue concentration. That might not have been the best way to do it. So I'm curious to see how this plays out. But, you know, finding that balance is the challenge, and nobody in the world has done it right yet. We're just trying to figure it out as we go. It's definitely a situation of building the plane as you fly.
Okay.
Also, I just got a note that the governor has not signed Ford's bill yet, but I believe that he will. It was negotiated with the governor's office, so I don't see that he won't.
On any of these things, feel free, either one of you, to jump in, or I'll just keep going on questions. Did you want to say anything on that, Robert?
I mean, I don't have too much to say. I mean, I think that when I think about cannabis, and I think about almost anything, whether it's the housing market, when we're talking about, you know, tech, we're talking about education, I think that it's particularly hard for states to get something like this right when we have systemic racism. In all honesty, I come from a sort of a pessimistic view on equity when you do it state by state basis. The way that capital flows, funding, investment is extremely systemically biased. And, you know, I think the bigger thing that I would say is a critique, and the thing that I sort of stick on, is that we put too much emphasis on the dispensary side when so much of the economy is based outside of the dispensary side of things. And to me, this is just, we turned the dispensary into the idea of winning a Willy Wonka ticket. And to me, this is a bigger, broader systemic problem. So, and I think, to be honest with you, that makes me different than almost anybody in any caucus. I mean, even in the Black Caucus, I think fundamentally the reality of the way that capital and incarceration and these systemic institutional measures exist in this country, that if you think we're going to get this right on a state by state basis, I mean, I'm willing to hedge that bet any day. And I think that if anything, this is a challenge for us, that if we were to ever do it at the federal level, which I'm somewhat pessimistic on, I think it was a little more optimistic, say, a year ago, but pessimistic on right now, is that we should actually not try to focus on the dispensary side at the federal level, it's all got to be based on the financial side. It's all about the flow of money and capital and investment, and not messed with actually the dispensary side, not messed with the the growing side, not mess with any of that. It's actually about how do you handle where and who gets money and gets invested in. That I think is going to be vitally important. And to sort of finish this off again, I think oftentimes when we think about legalization, we sort of base it was in sort of the liquor side, ending the prohibition of liquor. And I think in this instance, what we're really sort of talking about is actually looking at how we handled housing. And what turns out to be the key in housing isn't the location in which the house is. It's in how you use money and laws to pack people in and sort of concentrate poverty and deserts. And I think that truly comes from that financial side. So to me, I think this is the biggest challenge we're going to have, is that we're going to constantly be in an uphill battle to improve Black and Latinx participation within cannabis. And I think that until we can actually have changes on the sort of financial sector side, it's going to just be always a tough fight. And I think there's things that we can do that will help. I think this is stuff down the road. Again, I think this is constantly evolving. I'm still a big supporter of the idea that if you have a coffee shop, that you should be able to sell cannabis and then get on site. I think equitably speaking, being able to diversify your business options, I think is very important, particularly depending on the community you're in. I just think that, but I think those are all things that we're just going to constantly have battles over for the next decade. And I do urge that folks at the federal government get their act together, particularly on the financial side of things, because I think that will be hugely important.
I love the points you just made, Robert. Like, we're not going to fix it all in one industry. First of all, I think that's a mistake to think that we can undo all of the harms of the war on drugs in this one industry. And you're absolutely right about the access to capital piece. And one of the things I really struggled with through the whole process was, we intentionally chose to do a limited license market so the license would have value, right? But then we had people coming back and saying, well, people who get a license because they're social equity applicants shouldn't be allowed to sell it, because then it's just going to end up being an all white owned industry. And no, the whole point is for this to be an item of value. The whole point is to give that leverage to bring in capital, because you have this item of value. And frankly, that opportunity to build generational wealth by selling that asset. And so it's such a complex puzzle. And I talk about all the time, when you're doing something complex, it's like a Jello mold, you poke it on the left side, it wiggles on the right. And we have to always be mindful of that. And your point about the flow of capital and how do we impact the flow of capital, that remains a tough nut to crack. This is an incremental process. And, those of us who are here to undo the harms know that, and know that we have to keep going, that there's no magic bullet. And this is certainly not the magic bullet.
Yeah, and I'll just end. I think I want to go back to the housing piece. I think moving out of the prohibition period is something is similar to alcohol and liquor. That's fine. But what we've now entered into is something very similar to the housing sort of battles of the mid 20th century. To be very honest with you, I think the 1940s to 1970s period of housing, particularly on how that impacted Black working class families, especially, I think is really sort of what hits me here. And I think that what we need to do is take the lessons that we learned from the housing fights that we had and not repeat them when it comes to cannabis. And it's just, people might not see that directly, right? They look at cannabis and you think, okay, well, it's got to be like tech, right? But it's actually, tech doesn't have nearly as many restrictive laws that we've seen when it comes to drugs. Housing, though, did in fact have systemic restrictive laws, and there were many solutions that were put into place that ended up being detrimental. They look good in the short term, but they long term had a lot of problems. And so when we think about this, we have to think about, we're now in a period very similar to the sort of housing battles. Where people are placed, the generational wealth piece, the investment piece. I mean, what we know is, the joke is always like Canadian VCs are going to, love what's happening in Illinois. And what do you do to undo that? That's a lot of things that particularly happen at the federal level. And I think our job over the short term is to try to just sort of fix at the edges, but not know that, and not bank that we're actually going to be able to completely get this solved. And the other part is to really, and I emphasize this to a lot of people, we had a huge town hall. I love how we're talking so deeply about this. I'm taking up so much time to talk about this. I'm sure there's a lot of topics we have to get into, but we had this huge town hall in South Shore in 2019. And everybody wanted, it was like 120 people in a room in South Shore. All they wanted to do was talk about the dispensary. And I told them the story about a very successful, historically rich family. I'm not going to name them, but I always say that they made their money in the fact that they were the only people who were able to move goods and from point A to point B after the Great Chicago Fire. They weren't selling the goods. They were able to move the goods, and simply being able to be involved in some other parts of this opening of the economy is important. But they were told, and everyone was told, this is your chance to make it rich. And I always say, like, sometimes what's as important for wealth isn't the ownership of the dispensary, but how much money you make in the job that you have. And if that job is designed to make sure that you have it, you keep it, and that you're able to get a home, or be able to buy a home, or be able to buy something good to sort of expand to a larger sort of aggregate demand part of the economy. And I think when you open up cannabis like that, there's actually a whole host of opportunities. And if we're not looking at that, someone's going to jump in and take advantage of it. And that's just my sort of bigger concern.
Yeah, we had some conversation, but not as much as I wished, about tangential industries, right? There was so much focus on the licenses and the value of the licenses and what it would mean to have a license, when, we also featured, an accountant who had been an agricultural focused guy who is now, has most of the cannabis industry as his clients, and his business has grown tenfold from, being the accountant to the farmers to being the accountant to the cannabis industry. There was a soda fountain company downstate that provides all the CO2 to most of the growers. Like, there's so much opportunity, and I want us to spend a little bit more time on that. I would love to see more of that.
Okay, before we turn to energy, let me just mention what I'm kind of thrilled individually about the two of you right now, from the vantage point of like kind of 50 years in this political game. Look at how everything we talk about, in particular this issue, your focus on equity. Okay, we know that's happening, and part of it maybe having to do with all the criminal justice and the shootings and so forth, and the pandemic. But it's really heartening to see our legislators trying to look at every aspect of legislation with the equity issue. Because as Robert said, and I think if people didn't quite pick that up, we now, of course, know about how important is accumulating wealth. And when they think about all this discrimination in the past, particularly here in Chicago, and restrictive covenants and things related to housing, basically got a whole generation of people, in this case, mostly Black, who never had the opportunity to do like a lot of us. I was 25 and I was able to buy this cheap condo, and then the condo was worth more. And they were denied that opportunity. And for most of us, unless you're really rich, your wealth is in the home or a condo or whatever that you own. So it's really heartwarming to see that. Now, let me turn to energy, okay? And on the energy issue about, what is going to happen, as much as you know, remember, I don't think most people understand what's going on, okay? So tell us a little bit more about the clean energy bill, and what do you think about it, and what's going to happen?
I will take lead on this. Since FIJA, which I try to explain, FIJA is going to be like its own thing. So let's not go down that path. Okay. The best way to put this is, there are a variety of different gaps when it comes to energy policy that a variety of different stakeholders want to fill, and they have many competing interests that contradict each other. And the best way to describe it is it's a headache for everybody, whether they want to admit it or not. So you have clean energy folks who they might be involved in solar and wind, or they might just believe in an ideological sense. You have coal that is, in all honesty, just begging. They're in they're trying to hold on for dear life as a viable energy source that, and they want to be protected as much as possible, particularly downstate. You have, we're going to get into Exelon and ComEd in a second, which has another different thing at stake. But you have nukes that Exelon has that that you can really tie to bad management, but need a couple of them need a form of a bailout. And then you have the political dynamics of ComEd having a dirty, nasty lobbyist who, or former lobbyist, I don't think he's a lobbyist anymore. And so you have these, and then you have this sort of youth-led climate justice fight that has fundamentally changed the way I think a lot of people, particularly myself, have seen the climate fight tied to racial justice and economic justice fight. So that led us to this sort of creation of this bill process around the energy bill, where the climate justice space wants to see decarbonization, particularly around, I believe, 2035 is a really key date here. So 2030 and 2035. Decarbonization will most likely impact coal. So coal hates the decarbonization piece. Then you have Exelon, who has nukes. Kelly, you jumping into this?
I'm trying, my mute is challenged, but keep going and I'll jump in.
Okay. So, and then you have, Exelon that, there is a couple of nukes who need support, but they're not politically the most, nobody wants to really dive in with them. But at the end of the day, what we do have is a unique opportunity. We can, we need to stop decarbonize by 2035. We're going to be able to fund in terms of equity, the solar and clean energy sector will have far more equity and investment, particularly around Black and Latinx workforce development. And we could, even though it won't be perfect, the energy bill, it can be historic. Now, the only problem are the people involved in this, particularly with coal, and I think Exelon, if they can maybe get out of their own way, they can play an important part in this history. And I'll finish this as this is a very hard and large thing to try to explain. The hope is by next Tuesday, when we go back down in the Senate, and next Wednesday, I think, in the House, that we have an agreed bill that doesn't have exemptions for the people who are destroying this planet. My favorite thing to say to people is to put them on the spot, particularly if they're with coal or in the energy space, is if they have grandchildren. And I ask them, what do they think about putting their grandchildren in a planet they're destroying, and let them answer it, because they can answer it to me. I don't need to do that answering for them. And it is almost always a horribly shocked answer of, I can't believe, one person I won't name literally said to me, do you think climate change is real? And that's when I said, that's all I need to know about how serious you are about this policy. But hopefully these sort of different stakeholders don't get in their way, and we can get an energy bill done, particularly with really historic levels of clean energy investment and decarbonization.
And that's a great summation. These bills have been, even CEJA, have always been really challenging for me, because I have a fundamental problem providing funding to a profitable corporation. And Exelon's behavior this session was akin to, a group of teenagers who were caught having a rager in their parents' basement on, last week, having another party this week. They just kept doubling down on their dirtiness, and it speaks a lot to why I've never voted to provide a bailout to a profitable company. At the same time, like I have a great deal of empathy for my colleagues who represent the districts where those jobs could be lost. I hear a lot from folks in my district who want us to move away from nuclear energy, but I also hear from the districts where those plants are as well. It's an incredibly complex situation, made more so by the bad actors who refuse to acknowledge their bad actions, and ultimately would like their bad actions to be financed by our constituents. So it is complicated. And I do hope we end up with an agreed bill. The news today was that coal raised its head again to try to get exempted. We'll see where it all lands, where it all shakes out. We joke in Springfield that, days are like dog years. And, so between now and Tuesday or Wednesday, in the case of the House, a lot can happen. And I can imagine, quite frankly, that we're going to see way more roller coaster hills. And our challenge as legislators is to not get on the roller coaster, watch it and let it work its way out, and let the negotiators do their thing. I believe that, Ann Williams, the House sponsor, has all the best interests at heart, looking for that truly historic bill that's going to, make our planet better for our grandchildren, whether, even the grandchildren of the people who don't believe in climate change. But it's one of the more complex things that we work on.
Okay, and we'll all be watching that coming up. Let's jump over, because we're trying to keep a close eye on the time. Jane Balanchi, I hope I'm Balanchi. I don't know if I'm mispronouncing your name, Jane. Jane says she was disappointed by the ethics bill and is wondering what can maybe done to strengthen things in the future. This is always a hot one for legislators. Thoughts about that? The bill, most of the reform groups were pretty critical of the bill, and mostly, not that there weren't some things in there, but given the level of frustration, the kind of indictments and convictions and apparently ongoing things, and we can expect more, that it was, we didn't really get off the back burners, kind of the argument. So what do you think?
Well, I would start with all of the things that are alleged in the indictments are already illegal. People act with impunity. And so, that's the big challenge, right? Like, we can legislate a lot of things, but we can't legislate that people obey the law. But, as we worked our way through working groups and caucus meetings, I continually said our history is to do the least we can do. And we lived up to that. We did the least we could do. And we'll continue to work and push. And those of us who work on the reform side will continue to push for more. But, again, the stuff that has us embroiled as, the scandal capital of the world was already illegal. They just didn't care. And that's really important to acknowledge. You can't make a law about, the speaker using his best friend to solicit bribes, because we already have one. And that's as real as it gets.
What about this part, though, on that, Kelly? For example, let's pick on my old friend, Ed Burke, okay?
Please, let's do.
Some of the things, whether a question of legality, is that we have too often, the issue of outside income can be a fair one for some, because state legislators are generally seen as part-time, and they have a right to try and benefit themselves as well. But when you have the cases of the Burke or the people involved in the tax business, that basically, and like in Burke's case, chairman of the finance committee, and yet he represented not just Trump, but represented United Airlines. I could go on and on and on. And I think most of us would agree, even though it's not clear enough in most of the laws, that you have a fiduciary responsibility. So if you're trying to make a deal for American Airlines, United Airlines, or Trump, you're basically taking that out of the public's hand, so to speak.
Yeah.
So, so in other words, there's lots more issues than just the fact that, yes, no matter what we do have the bad apples and they'll continue. But, what else? What else about the law or Robert, either one that,
And Robert, I don't know if you guys ran into this in your discussions of this in caucus, but like, there were a lot of yes buts as we talked about things that we might want to change, right? And just specific to the Burke question or the folks who represent tax buyers or tax appeal stuff, like attorneys under their code of ethics can't reveal a lot about their clients. And so on our side with our economic interest disclosures, we had lots of conversations about forcing disclosure of that stuff, but attorneys really can't do that. And so you run into these places where there's just conflict that, yes, this sounds like a good idea, but that can't happen on that side. And to the extent that this is technically a part-time gig, but who in the universe is going to find an employer who's going to employ them 6 months out of the year when they're going to be gone 6 months out of the year? So it's a messy situation to start with. And every time my Jello mold analogy applies in so many circumstances, but you're going to poke it on the left and on the right, you're going to run into conflicts on the other side. And so that does become challenging. And Robert, I don't know the extent to which you guys got into that as well, but it got really tough having some of these conversations.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny. I guess we're learning that I'm optimistic on the long term, pessimistic on the short term. My belief is that fundamentally what the question we're actually asking ourselves is, how do we actually value government? How do we value people who work in government? How do we value our legislators? And if the idea that you're supposed to get paid whatever the amount that we get paid in our, if you're not a committee chair of high 60,000s, if people think that's okay, that's fine. Except if you live in a large chunk of the state, it's going to be, and if you want to have kids, it's going to be a complicated, difficult situation for you. I'm not here. Look, my belief is that we should actually really be investing in the idea of being part of government and the state apparatus something that is, worthy and respected. But that's not for me to decide. That's the decision that voters have to make on when it comes to this. If they believe that they don't want to see any conflict of interest, well, then you have to say that you want to value the people who are supposed to work for you. And I think that's the challenge that we're at. And I think anytime we came up to this question, I always felt it like, okay, I understand that we don't want conflict of interest, but because we undervalue working in government, whether that's being elected or not, we undervalue that so much. And, I'm going to get all hyper critical and deep and say the word neoliberalism, but in a period in which that happened, well, all you've done is now put people in this position where they're stuck to maybe being faced with a conflict of interest. And that conflict is actually, is their kid going to go to college and are they going to pay for it? That's the conflict of interest we're talking about here. And that's conflict of, and at the end of the day, that also means that you don't get regular working class people, particularly Black folks, in elected office because it's very difficult. It's expensive to run for office. It's expensive to be in office. It's expensive to live, particularly in cities or in municipalities in the state, not just Chicago. And I think that that's the challenge that we're facing. And to me, I've used, as an organizer, I'm used to living, sort of getting paid $26,000-$30,000 a year. That's something I'm used to. That's a decision, I make all the time. Sometimes I'm like, oh God, I can't believe I'm doing this. Maybe I should go get a law degree. And then I tell myself, I don't want to ever get a law degree. But so that to me is like, okay, well, I'm used to that. That's something I've made a decision on. But now that I'm, by the way, is there a light shining through? Am I trying to get through? Okay. So I'm about to get married next year, mid next year. And all of a sudden, 30-year-old me has different conversations than 36-year-old me, where I start thinking about, okay, getting married. That's expensive. They mark up everything that involves wedding. I mean, I told my fiance, I was like, well, what we should do is we should just get married and then call it a party to avoid a markup on that. We want to really lay down roots, you know, be able to get a home. Well, that's super expensive, and the market isn't easiest. We have low interest rates but high home costs. What an amazing combination. So we have that going on. And then we started having discussions about kids. And it really hit me like those are all expensive things. And I am at a level of privilege, more so than most people, where I can afford parts of this, maybe not all of it. And do we want to be able to say that people who are regular folks living their life can be part of our government or not? Then we need to fundamentally change how we value that. Because the greatest conflict of interest that I see isn't necessarily someone working at a law firm and working in government. It's whether someone's able to send their kid to college, whether someone feels like they can pay their rent or their mortgage, and whether someone's able to feel like they can live their life. And if they can live their life in dignity, they're going to be able to actually give more dignity to the people they represent.
Let me just say that, because I want to keep us moving, that I don't know, kind of the horse in the cart here, okay? If anyone doesn't fully understand what Robert is saying, a little bit Kelly too, is that we use the word value. Basically, if commissioners and our state legislators, the aldermen are doing a little better here in Chicago, but if they're not getting paid, what you might say a significant salary, they're going to be looking for other work too. So let's say that's a real factor. I certainly talked to county commissioners as well. But we'd be in a much better state as a society and a state if, in fact, while we wrestle with these difficult issues, that we did everything possible to have as much honest information, okay? Because if you choose to be in public office, you're in public. And so let's say that we don't have the strictest lobbying laws, et cetera. But outside income and those kinds of should really be much more clear. The statement of economic interest, all sorts of things. The more I suggest the legislature can do to say, hey, okay, we're trying to set a standard because you all, the good guys, in many cases, you're stuck with the bad standards that the others abuse the system will. And they're not just because they don't make that much money as a state rep or state senator, they're just crooks, okay? Mm-hmm. As Kelly said, they're breaking law anyway. So, but let me just say a final thing on that is that the good news, at least for me, I like the fact that the legislature was changed, at least in the sense that we allowed Chicago not to be preempted. Now, preemption means that, it's my interpretation is that Chicago has stronger laws, okay, on some of these issues. And if they weren't, if they were preempted, then those would be wiped out. And I know there was an attempt to do that by some, and I'm glad at least that didn't happen, at least, because I know there's a lot of concern about the small rural areas, but for me, the real kicker is the heart of and I'm not saying there's not problems elsewhere, but Chicago and Cook County are pretty much a big part of where a lot of this stuff happens and is encouraged. Anyway,
no, I agree, David. We definitely like the preemption argument was frustrating because yes, there does need to be alignment in definitions and things like that, but that doesn't mean that we're right and they're wrong. And to the outside income thing, I vividly remember when Mike Quigley got elected to Congress. He lived in a house near Wrigley Field, and his block had a practice of renting out their garages for parking. It was, like they all did it. They charged for their garages. And as a member of Congress, he couldn't participate in that. Like their rules are such that he couldn't even rent out his garage for Cubs games. And that kind of stuff, we haven't even begun to contemplate. Like when you go to Congress, that's your income, period. And that's a big difference.
Pretty nice income.
Yeah, it isn't a bad income. And whatever cash you might have gotten from your garage, I think you're okay.
I think citizens, again, would feel much better. Let's say you paid commissioners more or state legislators more, but of course, part of that would be nice. We certainly don't need 50 aldermen, and God knows if we need that many legislators. I like the LA model. I think it's in their county, but they have 15 people, but they're very talented, and they both are executives and legislators. But anyway, go ahead, Robert.
They make $250,000 a year, I
Yes,
think,
they
too.
do.
But that's a different conversation. But
You gonna move to LA?
but
No, please don't.
I was gonna say, David, I was just gonna add that I agree. I think the transparency part is the fact that because we don't have the transparency there, that if you're a bad faith actor, you can use the argument of, oh, well, I got to pay for my such and such thing. And that's where it's like, well, okay, well, what does that actually look like? And that's the key to the transparency argument. And, again, I repeat, I'm such an open book that I'm sure it's like not the most politically healthy thing to do. But I do think like the transparency part has to be out there and upfront. But the same thing is the transparency needs to be like, we need to have a fundamental discussion about the value of government. And again, it's not just the elected. Like I want to make that very clear. This goes across, staff levels and everything along those lines. That some, you see these stories, these sort of right-wing stories about like a small town mayor and their pension. And it's really just a scare tactic because that's not actually speaking to the broader issues in terms of government. It's just an old right-wing thing to be like, can you believe it? And it makes everybody scared and riled up, but it doesn't actually help clean up government. It's often coming from people who are politically not the cleanest politically. So I think that is, to me, this is again one of those things where it's just so much in terms of contradictions, in terms of ethics and government and the value of government. But I agree that the thing about it is that someone takes advantage of acting in bad faith. They actually just ruin it for the rest of us who are trying to do good stuff in terms of representing our constituents and representing the district.
Okay, let me say something that's not a question. Many of you have been asking about kind of the fair map, redistrict, et cetera. As you may know, certain Republicans have actually sued the Democrats on that bill. So I'm not going to ask them a question about it for the obvious reasons. So only certain people can discuss that legally. I will say this, because I like this to talk about kind of the real world of politics. So two quick things. To the extent that I understand that, everyone in theory believes in fair maps, but often the people that really look at most carefully, what they're concerned about is fair. Fair for many years did not mean Blacks and Latinos being in office. So that's a crucial thing for many people. And what the legislature was faced with, right, is that if they didn't act when they did, there would be a vote of the commission. And of course, there's 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats. And of course, they would disagree, which is the Republicans' goal. And then they flip a coin. Okay. And so the real question would be, should the Democrats that have far more supporters in Illinois than the Republicans, should they take a chance to let the Republicans, by a flip of the coin, rather than any quote justice thing, draw the map? Anyway, so that people need to know that. People that are very concerned about the maps. Also, because I think President Obama's comments have been taken out of context. He always emphasizes it's really important that we look at the federal redistricting. It's very hard for me, and there's friends of mine that really, they all want fair maps, but it's hard for me to ask you all, okay, to do something like that when you see states where the Democrats have more voters in the state, and yet the Republicans control the state legislatures. And yet that, at the federal level, if that's not being dealt with, how sacrificial lamb do you want Illinois to be? So I just wanted to mention that for our friends who, I'm not going to ask that question. I'm watching the clock. Let me ask you this, kind of before we get out of here. Is there anything you want to mention? We didn't get to some of your criminal justice, Robert. What do you think were some really good things or some bad things? Just one or two. And particularly, you did a lot, Robert, in the criminal justice. So tell us about some of that.
Well, I should point out that Kelly did a lot on a thing that I played my role to get done. But is it cool if I shout out? I want to particularly shout out CESA, which is the mental health first responders, because a lot of stuff has been getting a lot of media attention, but I don't think people realize the history. I think it's the first in the country to do mental health first responders. And I think, and you hear about this all the time. Oh, mental health first responders treatment, not trauma, is a thing that a lot of people have been doing in the city. And Illinois will be the first state in the country to have a mental health first responder system, or mandating a mental health first responder system. And a large part of that getting done is Kelly just, excuse my language, kicking ass in the House. And every time Kelly does, again, excuse my language, kick ass, it's a challenge for me in the Senate to make sure that I hold my end of the bargain, hold up my end of the bargain. So
Robert and I do a lot of 1-2 punches together. So we've done several bills together. We continue to. You're my go-to guy. I feel like I'm your go-to girl. But yeah, that was I love how under noticed it is, honestly. It's pretty cool though.
Okay, but back to that question a little bit. In anything that you thought was particularly significant, because legislators always get their butts kicked, as no matter what they do, significant or things that you were pretty disappointed it didn't happen.
I mean, I will say parental notification, P&A, not getting done was pretty disappointing. I think that was, the idea that people, the very idea of trapping a young person into this position when it comes to abortion is, it's horrible and it's disgusting. And there's so much sort of parochial paternalism that exists. And, the idea of looking out for that, that young woman I've got to make sure to look out for, it's not actually helping. It doesn't help anybody. So not getting P&A done is something that's a disappointment. And I hope that we'll be able to get that done sometime before the next session. But,
And Robert, as someone who, when I was working at Now, that was a personal loss. That bill happened while I worked for Now. I take that very personally too, and it's one that we do need to take care of. We say you can't legislate good parenting. As a 16-year-old runaway, I'm really lucky I didn't get pregnant. Because I would have been screwed in Florida. So yeah, that was a big one. But at the same time, we lifted the prohibition on judges waiving vehicle code violation fees, which is huge. That's something that it landed on my desk. I wasn't really sure how we were going to pull it off, and we did. And so now judges can make that determination. And frankly, the idea
tell us a little bit how that helps people.
Yeah, so we've been doing work around fees and fines, and we created an opportunity to use community service hours to make up for those fees and fines, but we were valuing those hours at $4 an hour statewide. So the bill that we passed actually raises that to at least the minimum wage, which grants judges the opportunity to go even further. And I see a judicial hopeful there on screen who I know is going to value humans' time. But we also removed the prohibition on doing that for violations of the vehicle code. And that was something that had been compromised away in an earlier version. And there was huge backlash to doing. But, just because someone has a moving violation or a DUI doesn't mean that they, are any less poor at the end of the day. And so lifting that prohibition, and it's a Cook County pilot program. But I believe that when we come to the end of this process, we're going to prove that it actually doesn't take it, cause a hit. It's all about, counties and cities and the state, frankly, balancing their budget on the backs of the poor. We should not be budgeting based on punitive fines. We should be providing the services that are required, including operating our court systems, without counting on pulling blood out of a turnip. And this is a huge first step towards that. So that was a big, wonderful surprise. I didn't come into this session planning to pull that one off, but we did. So there were some good surprises too.
And that's a really good one because again, we earlier talked about how people pay more attention to equity. If you're really concerned about the little guy, okay, this is what you're talking about here. Governments are always seeking money, and I'm not to say bad bureaucracies, but they're always raising this fee and that fee and so forth. And if you got a lot of money, that's not such a big deal, okay? But when you don't, and all of a sudden they're impounding your car, or there's these legal fees or whatever, that's really difficult. So I'm really glad that you're looking at that. But I still have a bone to pick before we're finished. And that bone is—
You always do, dear.
I have several, but I'm being nice. So why didn't Assessor Fritz Kage's, in my mind, important bill passed? He has been reforming the assessor's office from the scandals there and trying to make sure that, particularly at the commercial level, we have accurate information as to what things are worth. And we have all these cases that we hear about all the time in the press where a big company X, tells SEC for some legal reason that they bought the property, the property's worth $100 million. But then when it comes to debating with the assessors off the Board of Review, it's only worth $60 million. And all the assessor, if I understand, is asking is they provide some basic information that most other states do. And yet, that didn't pass last year, and to my best of knowledge, it didn't pass this year. Is this just because the Barrios and the Barrios backers are still too strong in Springfield?
I love that we just literally looked at each other like you. I was just like, whoever wants to go first on that one, that would be great. Kelly, I really think
I'll
We're almost out of time, so you're lucky.
Bring it, baby, bring it. It's fine. I think that there are a lot of pieces, including a lot of what we already touched on the ethics conversation. What constitutes a conflict of interest remains an open question in our building. But also, the truth of it is the attention span for complex issues isn't always broad enough for folks to truly understand. I've carried a couple of property tax bills over the years, and like when you start to talk, and Robert and I are both super nerds, and we get deep in the weeds of the policy, and so we can be very conversant in what it means and what the impact of something's going to be. And some of our colleagues, when we come to them with these more obscure issues, like the curtains go down, and they really need to understand exactly what you're saying. Also, that particular circumstance you're talking about also seems like a case of maybe a lie to the FEC, right? Or the SEC, right? Like, can we get them that way too? And we probably should look at both ends of that equation. And I was talking to Fritz yesterday about this exact case. But the beauty of a citizen legislature is that we all know a lot about a lot of different things. The challenge of a citizen legislature is that sometimes things are so complex, it's really hard to find an audience for them.
Fair enough. Well, hopefully I'll be one of those supporting Fritz's attempt next time. Okay, now we're just about out of time. Is there any last comments from either one of you?
I just want to say thanks. This was a great conversation. I think that all of you gave me way too much time to rant. And so I just want to say thank you so much for that. I'm glad everyone got to hear me go off. I think I went off on cannabis for quite a long time. But I think this is great to be able to have that space and talk about what we're doing in Springfield. I will finish this. Let's see, I'm going to try this. I'm going to tell myself I'm going to actually stop talking. But I'll finish this and say that one of the larger challenges of being a legislator in Springfield, but representing a district in Chicago, is oftentimes people know what's happening at City Hall or what's happening in county government. And when it comes to us, we're like a myth. We go down there, stuff happens, you find out about it May 31st, and then it's done. And so the more we're able to talk about what we've done and what we're doing, the better. And for me, at the end of the day, what I care most about, and I said this earlier about transparency, is trying to remove the curtain, whether that curtain is real, thick or thin, whatever it might be, so that the public can learn more about what we're doing is something I always love to do, and I really appreciate it. And just want to say thanks for having me, David.
Good. Kelly?
I can only ditto Robert with that. You know, he's absolutely right. And also, you know, I really loved your sharing that parallel with housing law. Like it's the kind of stuff that, you know, when we're down in Springfield and, you know, hanging out either, you know, when I cook or whatever we do, you know, having that opportunity to hear those thoughts is huge and makes a big difference. But having our constituents have that opportunity to see us have those riff sessions, not only humanizes us, because you're right, most people don't know what we do or what it means. But also just broadening that audience, being open to the questions. You know, Robert and I are two people that do this all the time in terms of, like, you know, I'm happy to sit with a group of constituents and play Stump the DJ. I'll answer questions till they run out. And I appreciate that opportunity to do that. And I value those moments with my constituents and getting to hear what folks are wanting to know about, because that shapes how we do our work. So thank you for providing this forum, y'all. It's always fun.
Well, thank you. I'll just jump in and say thank you so much to Senator Peters and Representative Cassidy. Please keep working in the legislature, and please come back and tell us about everything that you're doing. Our doors are always open. And of course, thank you to our moderator, David. Again, this virtual town hall will be available on our Facebook page, as well as on our website at www.goodgovernmentillinois.com. And once again, your support allows us to keep putting events like this one on. Show your support at www.goodgovernmentillinois.com. Thank you, everybody. Have a great night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.